My name is Sharon Hirsch, and welcome to this video cast. Introducing my new book, Belonging, Finding the Way Back to One Another. I'm with Chuck DeGroat, professor at Western Seminary, and the author of one of my favorite books called Wholeheartedness, and the author of a new book entitled When Narcissism Comes to Church. We're going to be talking about the church today. What the pandemic, with its distance and division and disconnection, has revealed about the church and what needs to change. Welcome, Chuck.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. It's good to see you. Good to be with you.
It's good to be with you. I think people are excited to hear what you have to say, and I know I am too.
Yeah.
I thought I'd start with a quotation from Barbara Taylor Brown, who wrote that the church proclaims the priesthood of believers while we continue with the hierarchical liturgy, clergy, and architecture. We follow a Lord who challenged the religious and political institutions of his time while we fund and defend our own. We speak and sing of divine transformation while we do everything we can to maintain our equilibrium. If redeeming things continue to happen to us, in spite of these deep contradictions in our life together, then I think that is because God is faithful even when we are not. Well, all of this has been intensified by the pandemic. Online church has taken away big events, celebrity pastors to some extent, because we can shop online for whatever pastor we want.
Mm-hmm.
And one study from Boston University found that a third of people who go to church say they may not come back anymore. What do you make of all this, Chuck?
Well, this is probably a good time to announce that I'm starting an online church, Sharon.
Oh, yay.
I'm kidding.
I'll come.
Yeah, right. Oh, I love that you quoted Barbara Brown Taylor. I would love for her to be my pastor. And I think that one of the things I've learned from her is that God sometimes works best in the dark. And I think culturally, we're in a season of disorientation, disorder, confusion, right? And so I like the word that you used. It's revealing something about who we are. I happen to think that probably there probably needs to be more disorientation. Like I think we become afraid of this, right? And we want to preserve our institutions. And in the midst of the disorientation, in the midst of our institutions failing, we grasp tighter. And your books have done a really good job of talking about this phenomenon in our lives. We want to control, we want to fix, we want to put it back together. And I do think that the pastors that I'm most intrigued by right now, and I was a pastor for 12 years, and so I'm really tuned in to how pastors process these kinds of things. And the ones that I'm most engaged with, intrigued by right now are the ones who are saying, I'm not going to fight this. I'm not going to try to create the next big thing. I need to be aware that there's something happening culturally. It probably would have happened with or without COVID-19, but there's something happening that looks like a kind of disorientation. I like that language. It comes from Walter Brueggemann. And we need to sort of honor the questions of this season and wonder together why.
Yes, and that's confusing sometimes. Because we start to, like you said, hang on to what I call secondary things, like whether the government should be able to shut the church down, or whether we should have to wear masks in church. And maybe that's been a problem in the church even before the pandemic, hanging on to secondary things.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why I read one woman quoted in the New York Times who said, well, if I don't have a community that I feel like I belong to, why would I invest anything in it?
Yeah.
And so it's curious to me that when we don't meet in person, which I think we were made for, to be face to face, soul to soul, but in this time of disorientation, as you said, that we kind of feel like, well, that wasn't my community anyway. I'm going to get my needs met elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so why are so many people crying out that the church does not meet my needs. The church has wounded me. The
Yeah.
pastor doesn't care about me. He just cares about church growth.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's complicated, and probably that could probably occupy us for the next hour, or 24 hours for that matter. I mean, I think, um, well, one of the things I've learned from your writing is that the Dark Night reveals our idols and our addictions, right? And I think that our idols and addictions are becoming more clear. I think our addiction to secondary things, as you said, it's becoming more clear in this season, how our churches have become social clubs oriented around political agendas and things like that, um, rather than the conduit to a sacred space and connection to God, right? I mean, I think I've always loved the liturgical tradition. I love when the pastor greets me with "The Lord be with you," and also with you.
Mm.
And in another tradition, the language is "Namaste." I greet God within you, and there is a sense in which when we come to church, we're coming into the sacred presence. When I grew up Lutheran, there was an eternal light, a candle that never went off, and that always intrigued me when I was young. But it doesn't feel like we're coming into a space where we encounter the transcendent anymore. I think at times it feels like we're coming into a space where it's divisive, polarized, where we argue about trivial things. And so sadly, we're looking for the transcendent or the something more, as you say, in belonging in many, many other different kinds of places. And you and I happen to do the kind of work where we hear from people in very intimate ways, where they're finding tastes of the transcendent. And so
Mm.
I do think God is one of the attributes of God that we don't talk about much, that I like to talk about, is that God is really secure. God is not afraid of these moments. God is not afraid of us. God is not afraid of dark nights of the soul. And God is sort of waiting for things to crumble so that God can meet us in the depth of our own brokenness, in the depth of the church's brokenness. And so I am actually a very hopeful person, even in a season like this.
Well, I'm hopeful too at moments. Do you think that the focus on secondary things has kept us from that transcendent?
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking this weekend about Paul's words in Corinthians where he said, I could have come to you with fancy speeches and philosophy, but I
Yeah.
came with one thing, who Jesus is and what Jesus did.
Yeah.
And that seems like the way
Mhm.
to the transcendent and maybe the way to each other, to community.
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes in my classes, I start with the Beatitudes.
Mm.
Jesus beginning his public ministry, talking about the nature of the kingdom with the words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, the patokos, the brokenhearted, those who've come to the very end of themselves." And I think the church at its best is a place for people who come to the very end of themselves. I think prior to Constantine, prior to Christendom, the church was a minority community, right? And I mean, I think God is a God of the oppressed. And I'll probably get hit from some folks for saying that. Chuck is a liberation theologian or a Marxist or whatever. But I just believe Matthew 5, God is a God for the impoverished, for the brokenhearted. And so what's interesting is that minority communities, people who are oppressed, have been talking about this for a long time. It's like, okay, white people, you're catching up right now, But we've been talking about brokenheartedness, the state of the church, not feeling welcome for a long time. And so I do wonder, on a larger level, what God is up to in this season. And while people like me are trying to hang on and preserve something of the nostalgic sort of old experience of church that they know, I do think that God is actually maybe moving us in a new direction, saying, behold, I'm making all things new. And that comes through a process of tearing some old idols down in the process, right?
So it sounds like you're saying a community maybe that feels like community
Yeah.
is joined in brokenness, in woundedness, in
Yeah.
neediness, not in
Yeah.
success and soaring
Yes.
and group think.
Yes.
I'm hoping that maybe one of the things that the good things that comes out of this season is that there will be a disillusion of group think,
Yeah.
because I think it's the opposite of what you're talking
Yeah.
about from the Sermon on the Mount,
Yeah.
which is coming just as I am.
Yeah.
Sing that in church, but we
Yeah.
don't often welcome it.
That's right.
I mean, I was thinking that about what Bonhoeffer said, who he's so great on the church. He said
Mm.
that groupthink is judging others in a way that blinds us to our own needs,
Hmm.
which that can feel good. I
Yeah.
mean, to be judging other people and thinking about their flaws and their failures and not my own neediness.
Yes. Yes.
And so groupthink, I think, has overtaken the church and has
Yeah.
really destroyed a lot of things in the church.
Hmm.
And so maybe we get back to that group communion that you're talking about,
Hmm.
from Matthew 5.
Yeah. Yeah. When we're in groupthink, we're in a kind of tribal mentality. We're very left-brained. We're very heady. What we define ourselves by how we disagree rather than what we need. And I've never been in a setting. You've been in settings like this where people get in touch with their deepest needs. And
Hmm.
I've never been in a setting where, let's just say, a conservative and a liberal are together when they're talking about their deepest needs, where they can't find a place of connection.
Right.
I long for belonging. I long for belonging too, right? And from that place of, yeah, I long to be known. I long to be seen. I do too. Wow. From that place of connecting with our deepest needs, I think that's where we meet each other.
And obviously, that's where Jesus wants to meet us, as he said
Yes.
in Matthew 5, because our souls are connected
Yeah.
by pain, long, loneliness.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think we mistake banding together for causes, whether it's to grow the church or um, for a pro life movement
Hmm.
or community.
Hmm.
I told a story in my book about a woman who slipped into church for the first time feeling that brokenhearted poverty of spirit.
Yeah.
She had just had an abortion
Yeah.
and didn't know that she came to church on pro life Sunday.
Yeah.
So slipped out before things even
Wow.
started because she was feeling so shaky. So, I mean, that shows me that even if it's a good cause,
Yeah.
when we all join together for a cause, I think this is what Paul knew when he wrote that to the Corinthians, that
Yeah.
it weakens our collective immune system
Yeah.
and contributes to this cancer of division
Yeah.
that you're talking about.
Yeah. And that feels so right. I think the American church has just added so much to how we understand the church and even how we understand the gospel. It's, Jesus plus all these different things that you need to believe to be a real Christian or the right Christian. And I do think this is a season of being humbled. Again, I do think communities that have been historically oppressed will probably listen to this and say, duh.
Yeah.
All we have is to connect around our needs. You're the ones who've added so much to it, but with the work I did, the hardest book that I've written, Sharon, is this work on narcissism, right?
I,
Because it's really kind of talking about really painful things in the church. And it's in large part because I've worked with a lot of pastors and church systems that are narcissistic. And oftentimes, if we ever get to a place of potential healing and growth, it always comes with a sense of awakening to, like, what have I done? I've made it about everything that it's not.
yes.
And there really is a kind of uh, a moment of profound brokenness, pain, self-discovery, disorientation that leads to reorientation, and they often emerge on the other side saying, I don't think church will ever be like that again for me, or I'll certainly never pastor like that again or lead like that again.
So it's interesting, Chuck. I mean, my book was supposed to be on narcissism, but
Hmm.
you wrote the
I remember
book,
that.
and
Yeah.
my publishers felt like, well, let's make a positive twist on that and make it
Yes.
about belonging, which really is the opposite of narcissism.
Yes. Yes.
Narcissism is all about me, and
Yes.
belonging is about offering welcome to
Yes.
the other. But
Yes.
could you further define what narcissism in the church is in a couple of sentences?
Oh gosh, yeah. So I think I love what we've done. I don't know, we were talking about the narcissism stuff. I don't know how long ago. Maybe it was 2 years ago, and I think what you said is really important. I think Brene Brown says narcissism begins in disconnection. Narcissism um, is a kind of orientation toward the ego, right? And so it operates not out of a place of humility or curiosity or brokenness, but it operates out of a place of independence, egocentricity, power, self-sufficiency, and from that place, we don't need people, or we don't think we need people. We certainly need people, right? But we think we could go it on our own. I suspect that many who are on the narcissistic spectrum will not pick up a book on belonging because they have everything they need
I
in
think.
them, right? And yet what we realize as we come to the end of ourselves is, oh, I long so desperately to be known, to be seen, to belong, right?
Mm,
So
it,
say more. I'd love to hear from you as we talked about this, as I was writing on narcissism, say more about how belonging emerged then.
well, first of all, I want to say that if anyone is watching us live and you have questions or comments, um, there should be a place that you can type them in, and we would love to respond to those. But the concept of belonging, I think, emerged as just the events in our society highlighted, as you said, how disconnected we have become. And we, as therapists, you're also a therapist, multi talented man, know that trauma, and we are in a time of trauma. So everyone is traumatized right now, whether they acknowledge it or not. I'm not sure what happened to Chuck, but hopefully he will come back. There he is. You left us for a minute. But
I'm back.
we are in a time of trauma, and we know that what trauma does to the brain is it makes it shut down toward connection. So I think we are disconnected because of trauma, and that's why the church needs to address the needs of traumatized people, which is to offer a sense of welcome and worthiness. So as I camped out on those words, welcome and worthiness. What we know as narcissism doesn't welcome anyone, and no one is worthy but the self. And if I'm dependent on my worthiness on me,
Mm,
then I'm in trouble.
yes.
And
Yeah.
so we go to that deeper story of God who writes worthiness and welcome into every story. He does say, come as you are.
Yeah.
Broken,
Yeah.
bleeding is okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. That's right.
and so as we interiorize that, then during this season of protests and viruses and compromised leaders and us, it should be the believers of the gospel, which means good news, that
Yeah.
are offering welcome and worthiness. But I
Yeah.
think you're onto something, that because most of us, I would certainly include me in that, have not experienced much oppression except the oppression that I create for myself.
Mm,
Um, I think we don't feel real motivated to
mm,
offer welcome to the
yeah.
bisexual, to
Yeah.
the Muslim,
Yeah.
to the person that we don't understand. We don't share their perspective. We don't agree with. What we have learned is to post a nasty little tweet or comment on Facebook and disconnect.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
in my kindest moments, I can believe that's because we're traumatized. So,
Yeah.
how should the church respond to this epidemic of trauma that we all are in, whether we acknowledge it or not?
Yeah, that last sentence is so important. We're all in it, whether we acknowledge it or not, right? And so, and to avoid it, we show up as that pretty false self, that glittering image, as Susan Howich called it, right? On stage, look at me, playing the worthiness game, as Richard Rohr says, when when uh, when it's all ours already. I mean, I think that's the good news of the book
Yeah.
Belonging, right? The father says to the elder brother, I am always with you, and everything I have is yours. It's all already yours already. You don't have to play the worthiness game. You don't have to show up as the false self. And that's the sad thing about it, is when we live out of that false self. And I certainly, one of the difficult things is people think that because you write books on these things, you're somehow beyond it or over it, right? Um, I know when I'm living out of my false self, when I'm working really hard, trying really hard to gain worthiness. Like, I really hope this talk with Sharon goes well so that people like me
Yeah.
and follow me on social media and buy my book, right? Rather than living from a deeper sense of my own belonging. And one of the things that we know about narcissism is that shame is the fuel of it, right? When we live in that basic sense of disconnection and unworthiness, we are more apt to live from the false self, to show up craving, looking for, practically begging for worthiness from others, for approval, for affirmation, rather than simply taking the risk and having the courage to connect. And it takes courage, right? I mean, you and I have worked with lots of folks. I was trying to think, we have like a combined probably 40 or 50 years of experience of not only working in the midst of our own brokenness, but watching as people come to us with presenting problems like depression or anxiety. But what you realize is really there's a deep longing for belonging, and there's such deep and profound disconnection in their lives. And so that's why I think I think I said in my endorsement of your book, it's the most important book that you've written. And
Mm.
I've loved all your books, but I just feel like yours is for such a time as this, where we feel so lonely during quarantine, during COVID, and we're longing for connection. You put words to it.
Hmm. Well, I appreciate that, Chuck. I think that it comes out of my own, like you said, emptiness at times and
Mm-hmm.
longing to be known and yet fear to be known.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we're back to the church where sometimes we wear a mask more than any other time. And if
Yes.
ever was a time to take off our masks and to, um, as you said in one of your posts on Facebook this week, kind of tell the stark raving truth about our life, that is how we connect.
Yeah.
And yet it's hard to believe that, because
Yes.
I still struggle with believing that if I'm real, if I get off these secondary issues and talk about the truth that I really need Jesus more than I even want to acknowledge, then I'm afraid that people will judge me, will think that, maybe I don't have it all together. I shouldn't be writing books. I shouldn't be doing this video cast, which,
Mm-hmm.
by the way, I see on Facebook that people are having a hard time connecting with it. It is live on my Facebook page. I don't know why people are not able to connect with it, but it will be posted later as,
Yes.
as a recording.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that people cannot connect.
Yeah.
Um,
I
but
noticed that too. I navigated over and I thought, oh wow, it's not up. But so we won't have questions coming in, but hopefully the conversation will be valuable when people tune in, right?
right, and I don't know. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, but we will we will continue to do our best. And
This is it, Sharon. Right now, we're living it right now. We're screwing it up, and there's lots of grace.
and as Barbara Taylor Brown said, God is faithful, even in the midst of technology confusion.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but I do hope that people will post their questions or comments when they watch it recorded, and that there can be
Yeah.
discussion, because
Yeah.
I think you and I are not the only ones who feel like if we show up and we're real, that we might not get the community we long for in the church.
Yeah. That's right. I
What do you
think
think of that?
so. I love that this just happened, right? I love that. So we're not live right now. People will have to watch it. But suddenly, about 5 minutes ago, I go from feeling connected, right-brained, present to this moment, to left brain anxiety. I'm looking on my feed. My image disappeared there, by the way, because I think I went on my phone and somehow it disconnected. So there it is. We bounce in and out of connection all day long,
We
every
do.
day. And there
Mhm.
are things that happen. There are things that pop up. I don't know about you, but I'll go onto Facebook and I'll see a post from a family member or a friend or a student that I think that is the most ludicrous thing that I've ever heard. And I need to go on and correct them right now. And suddenly I've moved from connection to disconnection, from the
Yeah.
possibility of belonging to to the probability of disconnection, of strife. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be prophetic. That doesn't mean that we ought not be truth tellers. I do think that we have to step in prophetically, particularly in moments like this, on behalf of those who live perpetually in disconnection and lack of belonging, right? But it is to say that I think I've learned a lot from understanding the civil rights movement, understanding the influences on Martin Luther King Jr., particularly Howard Thurman, who is a lesser known Black author, theologian, contemplative, who really, I think, in many ways, MLK's nonviolent posture arose out of the more contemplative disposition of Howard Thurman, and this sense that if we respond from a more reflective rather than reactive place, in other words, if we respond from presence, not from trauma, we'll be more impactful. It's not an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth. Rather, it's showing up in love. And so if they punch us in the eye, we don't have to punch back. We respond in love. We respond with presence.
And how do you do that personally? Because that sounds good, but the church is the place
Yes.
where most of us have experienced the deepest woundedness.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so, how do you become present in love to simply, as Billy Graham said, love God, love
Yeah.
us? When we do have these wounds, how do
Yes.
we not respond out of that?
So maybe I think maybe we should talk about trauma for a few minutes, because I
Okay.
think, trauma is a large piece of this conversation, and when we live in trauma, we know that it's almost impossible to connect. And then when we talk about racial trauma, we're talking about a much more significant phenomenon. But what we know is that most of our clients, and I dare say everyone, experiences some kind of trauma. It's the trauma of living in a broken world. And when we live out of our trauma, out of our pain, out of our reactivity, we know neurobiologically that it's absolutely impossible to connect, to belong. And so it really does take a process of intentionality and awareness of our own story, of our own selves, to get to a place of greater connection, right?
Yes. And one of the things I do spend a lot of time on in my book, Belonging, and I know you do in wholeheartedness as
Yeah.
well, is connecting to our story, because it takes
Yeah.
courage. It takes the ability to wade through some ruins in our lives to connect to our stories. And then I think we can create or join a communion of stories, maybe in the church. I often
Mhm.
think of Alcoholics Anonymous as a model, because I am a member of that club. And that is what it's about. It's a communion of stories
Yeah.
that come out of pain and failure, but also out of experience, strength, and hope. So we're
Yeah.
not talking about gloom and doom,
No.
but we're talking about being real that provides confession and connection and ultimately communion.
Yes.
I think that's what Bonhoeffer was
Yeah.
aiming towards.
Yes, that's right. And it requires us to be present to our lives, present to our stories, present to our hearts in a way that allows resilience. So 5-10 minutes ago, when we mutually realized that we're not live on Facebook and we get anxious, we could have sort of stayed in that place, or we awakened to the fact that, okay, I'm feeling kind of anxious right now and I just disconnected. So I'm going to take the risk to come back online and to face my discomfort and to name what's going on, and it's a ruthless truth telling with ourselves, not just with one another, but with ourselves. Like, okay, so what's going on with you right now, Chuck? What's going on with you right now, Sharon? You kind of disconnected. Come on back. I'm constantly telling myself in counseling sessions, when I speak, be here now, Chuck. Be present now. There's no other place to be except right here and right now.
Yes. And then we're back to the realities of the time that we live in, that we have to be present online, which we've just discovered is difficult, or on Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you do that?
Right. Yeah, you and I, we were talking before this started about, we've had similar problems, I think, with students where, after a little while, all we see is their avatar, right? And they go away. And I know in certain meetings toward the end of last year, faculty meetings and things like that, I became that avatar. Like, I'm just so tired. And we're talking about things that I'm not present to right now or not engaged in. And so I challenged some of my students, I think you did too, particular students, to show up. And it's tough. But I think actually there's a greater cost to not showing up. They'll say to me, well, it's tiring to show up. Right?
Yeah, it
And I
is.
want to say, actually, disconnection, neurobiologically, physiologically, disconnection is far more exhausting and takes a far greater toll than connection. And that's for some people who've lived in disconnection, that's somewhat paradoxical.
It is. I think that it's why we're not present, why we're distracted with skipping from one church to another when we do the online service, while we're looking at our Facebook and our Instagram and maybe posting a few things and jumping up to put some clothes in the dryer, because it's easier to live that way.
Yeah.
And to be present, as I said earlier, face to face, soul to soul, which is what God intended. I've been thinking this whole time as we've been talking.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to cover my mic.
Of my parents' church. They go to a small church that's called Grace Community Church, about probably 35 people on a good Sunday. Probably no one younger than 60. My dad, who's 86, is one of the elders of the church, and they are meeting in person. And they don't have a celebrity pastor. In fact, they have different speakers every week. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. They've had to do things like secretly turn down the organ because the organist was playing so loud no one could hear the words of the song. But yesterday and a week ago Sunday, everyone showed up. I mean, these are people in vulnerable categories for the virus, but they socially distanced, wore their masks. They showed up and packed boxes for Samaritan's Purse. They packed 200 boxes to send to children around the world at Christmas time. But mostly they showed up because they just wanted to be with each other. There's something about that generation that is not as distracted. They probably don't have Snapchat.
Yeah.
Or worry about what's happening on the newest series on HBO.
Yeah.
They're concerned about each other.
Yeah.
And in fact, even when I sometimes visit and see people, there's one woman in the church whose name is Mary Ann, who knows my children by name and always says to me, "Oh, dear Sharon, I'm praying for you and your children." And I know she means it.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that we have to have smaller communities and get out of the big box church to
Yeah,
experience? I mean, it's one church where I do believe there's community. It's not
yeah,
about all the superfluous things. And it is also about Jesus and who he
yeah,
is and what he did. And that binds them together as well
yeah.
as many needs.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm with you on that, and I suspect we might end up there. I suspect we might end up in smaller communities after a season of disorientation, um, uh, and decline in the white church, in particular in the United States. I think we might end up in communities of greater belonging. I think if we've learned anything through this time, presence requires embodiment, right?
Yeah.
And this is why, by the way, so many people focus on the cross as a central doctrine in the Christian faith. And I want to say, let's give more attention to the incarnation, the embodiment, the presence of
Wow.
Jesus, right? That the redemption story is a story that begins with the very presence of Jesus in our world, in our lives, to us, embodied. I know Kurt Thompson, who is a psychiatrist, has become a friend. He wrote a really great piece a few months ago about connection in the time of COVID. He said it's just really exhausting to do this, because we're not embodied. We're not there with one another. You and I know when we teach our courses that to be present to our students, to see them, to feel the dynamic in the room, to be present to our clients, it matters. And so I do think I think that some people are addicted to what they a kind of pseudo connection that comes in the big box church, the experience, the big show. I don't necessarily think they think it's pseudo connection, and I don't want that to be a judgment as if all it is pseudo connection. But I do think that there is a deeper sense of belonging that we discover in smaller communities, and that we'll probably end up there as we experience greater decline. And we know from the statistics that the white church is in decline, and we have to reckon with that.
So, smaller communities
Mhm.
based on our poverty of spirit, so our need for one another and God, which is kind of anti narcissism.
Yeah, it
And
sounds like AA.
yeah, it does. AA
Yeah.
is not perfect either because it's made up of people. And it's often what I say to people who complain about the church, who've been hurt by the church. I say the same thing that people have been hurt in AA. Find another meeting, find another church. There
Mm.
is a group out there somewhere. And maybe this is the season where we become begin-againers. And maybe some have not been in church for a while because they've become disillusioned by some of the things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it would be hard to walk your presence into a big box church, but that's not happening right now.
No.
So we could find smaller communities and be brave enough to show up and be present.
Yeah.
And that would be taking this pandemic, and as later on in Matthew 5, the passage you quoted earlier says, let it bring out the best in us
Yeah.
and not the worst in us.
Yeah. 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 Usually, I think in our work, in our therapeutic work, Sharon, oftentimes people come in with their presenting issue, but what we get to eventually, 2 or 3 times together, maybe more, are some deeper, more core issues. And I think in a dark night of the soul, kind of larger cultural experience that we're in right now, I think people are discovering a deeper loneliness that was there before this all started. But I think for as much as I like social media and the opportunities to stay connected to you in particular kinds of ways and other friends in all different kinds of places, it's not a substitute we've discovered for the kind of real belonging that you're inviting us to. And so I think in that sense, Belonging is a really prophetic book, and it's what we need right now. I think it's no matter what it looks like, and I don't think you would want to be too prescriptive about it, and I wouldn't want to be, but find your way to one another right now, and that in and of itself is sacramental. Jesus will be present to you. I guarantee it. And so just find your way in the midst of your loneliness to one another and take the risk to be vulnerable.
So would you say telling the truth is sacramental as well?
I think so. I think anytime our hearts are broken open, to use sacramental language before one another, there is something of a divine exchange that takes place, and listen, I think something of what you said earlier, we become addicted to rituals. Um, Now, I happen to be a deeply sacramental person. I love my liturgical worship, but we are sacramental people, and God's like, oh yeah, it's fine. Like it's totally fine. I'm still there with you, believe it or not. Even when you're not in the physical building, having communion with one another, like, don't you think I can work through those kinds of things? I think this
Yeah.
is where we get back to God being just so absolutely and infinitely secure. Like, of course, St. Augustine once said, God is more near to me than I am to myself. There's nowhere that I can go where I can get away from God. And so God is infinitely available to us. God is infinitely available within community. God's not a magic genie. God's not an ATM machine. We don't have to put in the right numbers. We don't have to rub the bottle. Like, God is already here. And so show up and be present to the God who is already here.
And that sounds beautiful
Yeah.
and wonderful. And yet, I learned this from you.
Mm.
It requires a practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this time when we don't have to worry about all the church programs and the church meetings and the events, and it gives us the time to practice. First of all, being present to ourselves,
Yeah.
to the truths of our own story, to looking at the pain and the shame
Yes.
and the accomplishments that we've thought were all about us.
Yeah.
And even this video cast, I was reminded this morning that it is about God, and He's in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Whether we are in a church sanctuary or in somebody's living room watching a recorded version of this, which is our second choice. And I do believe he's in control.
Yeah.
So we become present to ourselves.
Yeah.
And hopefully, in becoming present to ourselves, we hear his whispers,
Yeah.
unconditional love,
Yeah. Yeah.
knowing everything about us, uh,
Yes. Yes.
wanting us, even though he does not need us.
Yeah.
Because you said he's secure, but
Mm-hmm.
he wants us.
Yeah.
And that should make us lose our grip on the secondary things
Yeah.
and allow us to be present to other people. I've often wondered, what if our goal
Mm-hmm.
was to just make people feel worthy and welcome,
Yeah.
no matter what they believe, what choices they're making, what background they come from?
Yeah.
Because we've realized that's what I'm hungriest for. I learned a long time ago, Chuck, that having a successful book does not feed your soul.
Mm-hmm.
Having 1,000 views on Facebook
Mm-hmm.
does not quiet the hunger and the ache of the heart,
That's right.
but it's connection
Yeah.
with our true self, with others, and with God.
Mm-hmm.
I love the quotation that the kingdom of God, which I guess is the global church, the kingdom of God is not for the worthy,
Mm-hmm.
it's for the hungry.
Yeah. That's right.
And so, what if this pandemic made us all hungry
Yes.
for what we were really made for?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think that would have. I think that when Jesus started with the Beatitude, that would have like knocked the socks off of the disciples and anyone else who was gathered. Thinking that the Messiah was coming to put together an army to take on Rome. And he begins his public ministry with a word that begins in brokenness, continues with lament and grief, opens us up to new hunger and new thirst for justice in the world,
Mhm.
invites us to meekness and humility. Like, really, Jesus? That's it? I thought you'd be a conquering warrior, and yet the kingdom of God arrives when we come to grips with our fundamental fragility, limitation, and brokenness. And I think that's the great awakening. That for me, the counseling you teach in the counseling program that I was transformed by back in 1997 when my professor Gary Rupp sat with an arrogant, self-righteous, dogmatic Master of Divinity student and said, "Chuck, you look exhausted and you're only 27 years old, and it feels like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, and there's so much more available to you." And I still think there's a stain on the floor for my tears from that moment that Gary named it right in front of me as a young 27-year-old. There's so much more, and that's the message of belonging. I know that's the message of your new book, Belonging. If only we'd be willing to take what Jesus is offering and to recognize our hunger, our thirst, our impoverishment.
And so maybe in this season of coronavirus, where we feel like there's so much less,
Yeah.
the words that were spoken to you are true for all of us. This is the time to discover there's so much more. More than programs, more than, I think I quote you in my book about being down in the dust, not having to climb the ladder, to soar a little bit above everyone else, to look good, but to relax our egos and admit our hunger, our confusion, our loneliness, and know that's exactly why Jesus came.
Yes.
Not to have a big shiny program with worship bands that, they could be on Saturday Night Live sometimes, or with skits that could be on Saturday Night Live.
Right.
But with really one anothering.
Yeah.
I also quote David Brooks in my book. I love his book, The Second Mountain. And he talks about people who are humbling. I think of my parents' church again. People who are serving, who are willing to go to the margins, because we discovered we ourselves are at the margins. We're the ones who are poor in spirit. We're a part of that group of oddballs and fools and outcasts and, as my kids always tell me, totally uncool, that the church was intended to be for.
Yes.
I want to be hopeful that we don't double down and build another program. Because programs never connect to anybody. Only relationships do.
Yeah. That's it. And I think I'm sitting here thinking that this kind of talk sounds scandalous to some, that Jesus meets you in the midst of your dust. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. That Jesus meets you in the midst of your unworthiness for the sake of conveying to you your infinite worth, I don't know if that's too liberal or too conservative for someone. I guess I'm out and you're out. This is the only game in town for me anymore. I turned 50 in 2 days, and I've played a lot of games, and I know you have too, right? So it's sort of like, Thomas Merton once said, we climb the ladder only to realize that we propped it up against the wrong wall. And I've propped up a lot of ladders in my life. I'm done playing the game, what we have available to us is this opportunity to be present. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to fall back into places of disconnection. And I mean, God knows we just were on a road trip for 2 weeks as a family with my 19 and almost 18-year-old daughters. And they saw every side of me on that road trip. But, and the rage that comes when trucks cut you off on the road, by the way, and things like that. But for us to aspire to live from a place of belonging and connection. And I'm so grateful that somehow, some way, when we were talking a couple of years ago about trying to address something of what's going on in the world right now, that we landed on this conversation that engages the bookends of narcissism, which is disconnection, lack of belonging, and belonging, and connection, worth. what I said it earlier, but for people who haven't been listening carefully, I think what you've done is the message for right now. What you offer is, in the midst of us getting in touch with our loneliness, becoming aware of how desperate we are for connection, how desperately we need one another, and that the ultimate risk is the risk that occurs, and 3 feet in front of me with a person sitting there to say, here's what I need right now. Here's how I'm struggling right now. And to stop avoiding one another, but to begin to enter in from a place of new boldness and new courage. And that's what your book invites us to.
Well, thank you, Chuck. Let's end today acknowledging that God is in control of this program and where it will go, of our books,
Yes.
and who will read them, and of the church and what it has been and what it will become. I would love for you to speak to maybe pastors for a minute. One thing you would encourage them with in this season.
Yeah. So I think that one of the ways I've been talking about it most recently is you are neither the you that you are on the day where you receive your greatest approval, and you're neither the you on the day where you feel the most loneliness and pain. We pastors live from places of ego inflation and ego deflation. And so we step up on stage and people send the emails and come up to us after this, man, Chuck, I've never heard a sermon like that before. That was the most powerful. And then Sunday night, Monday morning, we're alone. We wonder if anyone cares. We wonder if anything we're doing means anything. And so oftentimes pastors live in this kind of bipolar reality. And I think there's a sense in which we've got to grieve that person that we hope will be, the influencer. And we've got to befriend parts of us that are lonely, scared, confused, afraid. And so the hope is that God knows our true self. God knows who you really are. And take the risk to step beyond illusion of ego inflation and ego deflation, and take the risk to be known. And that's the work that we get to do. I get to sit across from someone or virtually and say, well, tell me what's going on. I'm really scared. I'm really so lonely. I looked at porn the other day. I think I might be gay. Whatever it might be, okay, tell me. Jesus meets you right there. Jesus loves you. It's okay. That's what I'd say.
And I encourage pastors to pick up your book, When Narcissism Comes to Church. I think it will challenge them, encourage them, not just pastors. And I want to leave an encouraging word for those of us who are congregants, whether we're faithful or not faithful in our attendance of church right now, and what we're thinking about in the future, that the church is not limited by time and space. And that's why I know God's confidence, as you said, is in his security, is in who he is, and he is omnipresent. But we are limited by time and space. And so I encourage you to be the church this week. And that means to think about what you need and offer it to someone else. If you need a phone call, an encouraging word, a little financial help, just an compassionate inquiry into how things are going for you, be the church and offer that to someone else. And maybe that's how we start this small little revolution that could turn the church right side up.
Yeah, the little earthquakes that you talk about. Yeah, the little revolution. I love it. Thank you so much, friend.
Well, thanks for being with me, and I'll see you later on Facebook and YouTube.
Yeah, that's right.
I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, Chuck. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Grateful for you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.